I'm very sad that I can't welcome you in Bergen and in our new faculty building, but I do hope that you are safe and are dealing with these strange times wherever you are. I think, therefore, it's even more important that we gather like this, that we meet our peers and colleagues, that we discuss, learn, and get stimulated, and even take the opportunity to rethink and reimagine how we collaborate and cooperate, how we create discourses, communities, and how we are together. KMD has a long-standing tradition for creating a community for artistic research. As the previous institution of the Grieg Academy and Bergen National Academy of Art and Design, we created maybe one of the first conferences for artistic research, the Census Knowledge Series, which ran from 2006 to 2014. This was part of creating an international environment and discourse for artistic research. In Norway, this has been crucial to establishing a thriving research environment in all higher education institutions of the arts, and the Norwegian project program funding artistic research in Norway, the NARP, and not least, the formation of the PhD in artistic research in 2018. The artistic research project, Illuminating the Non-Representable, is led by a professor in illustration from Department of Design, Hilde Kramer. Her project received a 3-year funding from NARP, and this symposium is coming out of her research. Illuminating the Non-Representable is an international artistic research project with partners from Norway, Poland, Turkey, United Kingdom, and United States. The project will take a closer look at and discuss how representation and the narratives of us and the others are being used in cross-disciplinary projects. Participants from different disciplines will explore how illustration can cause a lasting change in contemporary communication. This symposium is the first of 3 symposia coming out of this research project. Transposition as artistic practice has invited guests from cross-disciplinary artistic practices to investigate and discuss the transformative role of illustration in contemporary communication. At the center of this is a discussion of what defines illustration practices in our times, and ethics and challenges connected to this. It is also an investigation of what discoveries may be found about illustration as it is transposed to other artistic expressions, and in dialogue with researchers, artists, and practitioners from other fields of knowledge. With that said, I'm very proud to welcome you to the symposium Transposition as Artistic Practice.
Gjenbruker, men videreføre, det er viktig forskjell. Det å videreføre, det betyr at du til og med tillegger og fører den fram i tid til en annen kontekst.
for det blir noe helt annet.
Ja, denne er så nydelig, altså. Bare kjenn her, altså. Det er ikke bare at du ser for, men det kjenner også. Kjempedeilig. Ja da, det er bra. Du må springe inn i huset. Ja, kom igjen. Sånn ja, flott.
Hello, my name is Amy Vandenhoeven, your hostess for this stream symposium, Transposition as Artistic Practice, that takes place here at the Faculty of Fine Art, Music and Design in Bergen, Norway. I'm a second-year Masters in Design student here at KMD, and I'm excited to be a part of this symposium. We started this stream session with a transposition, a stone being moved from Jondalen to Bergen by sculptor and associate professor at KMD, Charles Mikkelsen. Due to COVID-19 travel restrictions, the rest of the speakers you are about to meet are located in their own home countries: Switzerland, USA, Great Britain, Turkey, and various places in Norway. This is the first in a row of 3 symposia related to the artistic research project Illuminating the Non-Representable. The title, Transposition as Artistic Practice, was chosen to invite practitioners from different fields of artistic knowledge to discuss what happens when we choose to operate out of fixed positions and established views. The title was also inspired by a book published in 2018, Transpositions, Aesthetico-Epistemic Operators in Artistic Research. We invited the editor of the book, Dr. Schwab, editor-in-chief of the Journal for Artistic Research, to be the opening keynote speaker. His contribution is simply called Transpositions.
My artist's book Paris was published by Copy Press first in 2008, and as a second edition in 2013. For this second edition, the publisher integrated the title into his Common Intellectual series, tweaking both design and layout of the book. I had forgotten about this book in the context of Transpositions, a seemingly later obsession of mine, until my friend and colleague Gerhard Eckel reminded me that he remembered me using this term here first. And here it is. Imagine you're a photographer who has forgotten to take a camera onto a trip to Paris. You would still want to take some pictures, as there is so much to see and to share. You could walk into a shop and buy a pencil and a few sheets of paper and sit down at a street corner and begin drawing. However, because you're a photographer, you would realize you cannot just draw what you see, as that would feel like copying an imagined photograph. Then, there in Paris, you would have to reinvent photography now and all by yourself. The drawings in this book are thus the result of a photography that has been transposed into drawing. Photography is the reason why the drawings are as they are, even though they do not look like and are not, strictly speaking, photograph. This short preamble describes a concern that I had at the time, that the impact of information technology created a situation in which what looks like a photograph may be less photographic than other rule-based work, such as algorithmic drawing. This highlights two possible definitions of photography, which have often, but not always, been sitting peacefully side by side. 1. Photography's representational qualities, the likeness that it produces, and 2. Its operational qualities as a technical medium. These are quite distinct, and I relate to photography really only through processes rather than the kind of recognition that a photograph may afford. In fact, representation is really weighing photography down. Let's stick with the rule-based operations and look at the way they are constructed here. The basic rules are: 1. The arbitrary identification of a group of trees within a city space. 2. A visual study of that group and the surrounding architectural space, which leads to an arbitrary decision about the tree from which to start the measurement of the group. 3. A set of 3 measurements to the 3 trees standing closest to the first tree. 4. Another set of 3 measurements to the trees standing closest to the second tree, the tree closest to the first tree, excluding the measurement to the first tree, as this distance has been measured before. 5. The continual reapplication of Rule 4 until all trees within the group have been measured against their 3 closest neighbors, providing that no distance was measured twice. 6. The reconstruction of the group on paper. So, from the get-go, just like in photography, the rules are declared, and we should see in the images something akin to floor plans of the spaces between trees on public squares in Paris. So, let's have a look. This is all very well until somebody starts to remember, perhaps, what he or she has seen on the cover. Suddenly, not only for this image, another possible reading starts creeping in. that we see the trees themselves, or at least some illustration of them. This impression is in no way explained by the rules. While never fully actualized, it is also impossible not to see it, or at least aspects of it. The images become somewhat ambiguous. I should perhaps expand a little on the book format as a device in this context, as I have done already with reference to the cover, whose image might just implant the seed of such possibility in the reader's mind. But there is more. For instance, we tend to hold the book up, aligning it vertically with the tree. We don't hold the book in a position where we could see a floor plan, which would require us to hover over the square. In particular, as one type of text in the book takes the perspective of a person walking between the trees. Walking is part of the work. Even if walking was not necessary for the measurement of a site, it is important for its understanding. Moving through the site makes the figure tangible. In effect, when I make the drawing, I remember the walk. The remembered walk may even affect the pencil. The pressure I apply on the pencil when I draw a line is related in my mind to my step, the direction of the walk and the trees in front of me. As I walk, I am constantly thinking about the figure as it emerges in my mind. I look at the next distances to measure and try to bring all measurements into coherence. And of course, there is also something in the details of the drawings resulting from the drawing algorithms which develops the figure, as I call it in the book, inscribing a certain dynamics into the drawing, leading to different zones, or at least different spatial effects of the drawings that can't easily be related to the two-dimensional fixture floor plans offer. Here then is another sense of transposition, not photography transposed into drawing through some form of technical analogy, but the transposition of a local site into an image with unclear but specific demarcations. The aesthetico-epistemic operation, of which I will speak later, is such that in the aesthetic hold of a piece, its epistemic grounding is severed, allowing for the understanding to settle anew. The transposition of the site onto a paper becomes itself transposed into an imaginary operation between something recognizably real and something unrecognizably real, connected by an essential bond that tells us that this is that. W.G. Siebold writes on page 11 of The Rings of the Saturn. Contrary to normal practice, the anatomist shown here has not begun his dissection by opening the abdomen and removing the intestines, which are most prone to putrefaction, but has started, and this too may imply a punitive dimension to the act, by dissecting the offending hand. Now this hand is most peculiar. It is not only grotesquely out of proportion compared with the hand closer to us, but it is also anatomically the wrong way around. The exposed tendons, which ought to be those of the left palm, given the position of the thumb, are in fact those of the back of the right hand. In other words, what we are faced with is a transposition taken from the anatomical atlas, evidently without further reflection, that turns this otherwise true-to-life painting, if one may so express it, into a crass misrepresentation at the exact center point of its meaning, where the incisions are made. It seems inconceivable that we are faced here with an unfortunate blunder. Rather, I believe that there was deliberate intent behind this flaw in the composition, that unshapely hand signifies the violence that has been done to Aris kind. It is with him, the victim, and not the guilt that gave Rembrandt his commission, that the painter identifies. His gaze alone is free of Cartesian rigidity. He alone sees the shadow in the half-open mouth and over the dead man's eyes. Sebald's description of the painting and its meaning is certainly credible, giving an explanation to the overly deformed hand, which otherwise must be read as an error of the painter, who failed to correctly represent the appearance of this dead hand. But how is it possible that that unshapely hand signifies the violence that has been done to Aris kind? It is not on a conceptual level that we read in the crass misrepresentation an equally crass violence done first to the living, then to the dead Aris kind. More than this, it is a visual mechanism, a transposition, that produces such understanding through which not just the meaning is changed, but the whole of the visual space of the painting is transformed. The reason for the painting to work lies in the fact that the left hand is not just crassly misrepresented in a general way, but that it is misrepresented so that it appears, in fact, to be his right hand. As a consequence, we are, through the painting, but also through the gesture of Dr. Tulp, offered the same hand twice. Both hands, however, are linked through an enantiomorphic transformation between them that crosses the corpse and the painting. That is, if we see the hands as identical, we understand the type of transposition the painting proposes, and it is the visual experience of this transposition that affects the whole of the image. By seeing both hands as transposed but identical, we are presented with two operations, the one that Rembrandt on the face of it painted, and where what is monstrous is the hand that belongs to Aris kind, or the other, in which the dissected hand is seen as the other, untouched hand, that has become the site for a possible true representation, a healing process that also affects the rest of the image, where everything but the hand of Aris kind becomes monstrous. It is not a coincidence that transpositionality is made visible by way of the body, and the hands in particular. If we were to look at the work of the eyes only, we could be led to believe that they recorded a true image of the world, an original reflection that proliferates from the eye to the mind, connecting seeing with knowing. While your left hand lying next to a mirror may be seen as your right hand in it, in material terms, the reflection of your left hand is not your right hand. Hands are enantiomorphs that can only be folded into each other through illusions that mirrors afford, and not through movement or rotation in the space occupied by the body. Only were it to be turned inside out could the left hand become the right hand, an operation that does not only manipulate materials but cuts into them. Robert Smithson's enantiomorphic chambers from 1965 do not consist of two sculpture elements that are enantiomorphs. The title does not give a description of what the chambers are, but a speculation of what the work can become. Smithson developed the idea for the enantiomorphic chambers through his thinking about stereoscopic vision. The focus on the stereoscope indicates a shift from the physics to the physiology of vision. While in the first draft and model, the mirrors were supposed to throw the gaze outwards away from the center, disallowing the illusion of a single fused image, the final chambers offer a more abstract vision, since the chambers do not even attempt to mimic the stereoscope functionally. All that remains is the metaphoric shell of the metal frame, while the mirrors are attached facing each other, so that the only place to engage them is right in the middle of the installation. Here, however, one cannot see both mirrors at the same time, since one's own body is in the way. If the expected infinite reflection between two mirrors happens, therefore, it happens without the viewer. Rosalind Krauss writes, it is not just the viewer's body that cannot occupy this space then. It is the beholder's visual logic as well. Chambers explores what must be called a kind of structural blindness. This explanation is supported by an afterthought of Smithson that shows the artist's hand in his pockets, with his head lowered inside the installation. As Smithson says here, stopping of sight not by brutal opposition, but by lowering the head. However, this understanding does not only happen in the excluded viewer, rather, and this is a point Krauss misses, that which sees is turned on its head. As Smithson writes in an essay entitled Pointless Vanishing Points from 1967, it is as though one were being imprisoned by the actual structure of two alien eyes. This statement explains the notion of enantiomorphism within the non-enantiomorphic structure of the installation, because what is alien is in fact the installation as enantiomorphic to our vision. It is the sculpture itself that is like us, but not quite, and is completed through our exclusion. It's like a set of eyes outside my personal set, so it's a kind of depersonalization, said Smithson in an interview with Dennis Wheeler. Transpositions may, but need not utilize seemingly complex setups. In fact, those may actually be in the way of grasping the immediacy of the operation, which turns visible when objects become unstable. In the context of his ready-mades, Marcel Duchamp coined the term infrathin to describe the desired distance between an object and its appropriation. Thierry Deduve remarks that the infrathin separation is working at its maximum when it distinguishes the same from the same, when it is an indifferent difference or a differential identity. To be able to hold with identity and difference two contradictory terms in an apparently single operation signifies a different kind of logic, but a logic nevertheless. On the face of it, the infrathin is enacted in Felix González Torres' Untitled, Perfect Lovers, in the touching of the clocks and their initial synchronization as prescribed by the artist. When this piece is interpreted, most commentators refer to the fragility that it displays. After all, Perfect Lovers was conceived around the time when González Torres' partner, Ross Laycock, was diagnosed with AIDS, of which he later died. In fact, González Torres refers to his partner a number of times in the context of Perfect Lovers. While this interpretation certainly holds, the affective power of the work does not stem from its allegorical, but from its visual dimensions in excess of the objects and concepts that are deployed. Starting with the work's title, the choice and placement of the clocks, and the way they are set, all of this sets up a quest for an identity that the work within those conceptual parameters nevertheless fails to deliver. However, when looking hard, the coming together of the lovers becomes, against the odds, possible, but only when seeing has become exhausted. It is virtually impossible to look at both hands at the same time and determine their temporal relationship. Your eye is always looking at one hand too much, missing the precise moment when the other hand moves, or catching it only to discover that the other hand's movement had not settled enough to be beheld. The moment you see the clocks as one, they will have disappeared, creating a sense of timelessness which keeps breaking into vision. The place where the transposition happens is not between two clocks or two hands, but between two clocks and two hands and everything else that transposes with it, including myself, not anymore an onlooker, but one element of a larger constellation. When a glove is turned inside out to illustrate material operations, we have to imagine space attached to the glove and turned with it, so that I, too, will have moved and be moved. Moving from the one clock to the other and back, seeing both is to see nothing. You see transposition as nothing, if you see it properly. It is the origin of origin only as long as it is invisible. Transpositions are intellectually engaged with mainly in art, although it is clear that they are important in all fields of knowledge. There, however, they seem to have been black-boxed since their logic is troublesome due to the fundamental contradictions that make up their fabric. Transpositions cannot be resolved in the hard logic of calculation and knowledge. However, whenever something new is generated, we may look at this process in terms of transposition. Transpositions mattered at the beginning of Western philosophy, when the pre-Socratic world of mythos was transposed into the Socratic world of logos, or at any other point in time when paradigms shifted so fundamentally that the historical continuity connecting the before and after became deeply troubled. How did Renaissance people connect with their medieval contemporaries? How do we connect with those in the global South? Whenever those cuts that connect two incommensurables have come into view, philosophy has invested some effort to get into the phenomena, but at one point or the other, it always slipped into notions of religion, ideology, or art as a way to manage the negativity that it encountered. Rather than connecting the two phases of transposition, philosophy so far has opted to cut off a negative space from its own position, affirming its positivity, that is, its role and authority as the bearer of knowledge. In that function, philosophy has entered the schools of art and, in extension, expectations of research in art. The logic of transpositionality is not completely understood. In its fundamental operation, it consists of a material move of elements in space and/or time. However, the aesthetico-epistemic implications of transpositions may be such that, with the material move, the frame of reference also shifts, creating the distinct possibility that the before and after cannot be compared due to the lack of a frame of reference that encompasses both. Hence, transpositions are open to the abstract, despite their essential materiality. In fact, without an encompassing frame of reference, we cannot decide where a move has actually taken place. In its most extreme, a transposition could be a move in which nothing but the frame of reference has shifted. Everything is the same and yet different. It is, so it seems, the relationship and balance between the concrete and the abstract dimensions of a transposition that renders it intellectually interesting. It is as if the materially concrete produces abstract effects in the material, suspending, amongst other things, the very notion of object that we take as having been transposed. The setting somehow disappears when a transposition gets activated, and it is from within its operational activity only that it can hold together radically distinct worlds. What happens if we take this experience of transpositionality not as a negative exception to an otherwise positive philosophy prolonging its epistemologically precarious state, but if we jump ship and build a radical artistic epistemology from our experience with transpositions, replacing the philosophical thread in the fabric of artistic research? This new departure would consist of individual transpositions that are transposed into each other, creating relationships between what hitherto has remained unrelated. The point of artistic research may be to add new relations to the fabric of relations, something not easily done at all when distances are large and materials are stubborn. However, the philosophical thread cannot be taken out of the epistemological fabric of artistic research just like that. Philosophers have come to their position not because they know or know better, but because they are controlling what counts as articulations of knowledge. Thus, at the heart of a project for new departures of artistic research lies, first of all, not the substitution of knowledge by other knowledge, but a reversal of what counts as articulation of knowledge. Without taking the liberty to speak transpositionally, a different case will not be made. To this end, artistic practice must be obsessed with its exposition as research.
We thank Michael Schwab for providing the starting point to discuss transposition in a cross-disciplinary perspective. After the presentations today, we invite the audience to participate in a Zoom session to discuss the presentations. If you don't already have the link to the meeting, it will be provided on the illuminating.no and the kmd.uib.no websites, and also in the program under the stream. We will now have a short 10-minute intermission. When we come back, we will hear from Assistant Professor of Illustration, Jaylene Grove, from Rhode Island School of Design in the USA, speak about what is illustration, framing our research. Welcome back, everyone. We continue this section of the symposium with a presentation by Jaylene Grove, Assistant Professor of Illustration from the Rhode Island School of Design. This presentation explores the definition of illustration in the European tradition and interrogates its embedded assumptions and biases.
Hello, my name is Jaylene Grove. I'm an assistant professor in illustration at the Rhode Island School of Design in the United States. My permanent home is in Canada, however, and that's where I'm talking to you today. And my area of research is in history of illustration and illustration practice. I would like to use this opportunity to discuss what is illustration. How do we frame our research? Hilde Kramer has asked us to create a significant body of artistic research within the domain of illustration. We thought it might be helpful to have a research question for workshops and experiments to answer. So we ask, is illustration an act of transposition, and if so, what is lost, gained, or changed? Embedded in this question, though, is a previous question, or perhaps an assumption that needs questioning. What is illustration? I would like to use this opportunity as a laboratory for testing the definitions of illustration and illumination. I'm going to start with a historic European definition of illustration that will be familiar to many of us here. First, the illustration is determined by a text, that it is descriptive and realistic according to what we see with our eyes, that it is commissioned or art directed by someone other than the artist, and that it is destined for print. It's quite obvious that this traditional definition does not match the breadth or scale of what illustrators do today. Let us consider illustration as a category of object that is indeed determined by specific material context or tradition that has to do with industrial production. We can think perhaps of that illustration in a children's book. This is pretty clear-cut. I would like to distinguish this concept of illustration as a thing from the idea of illustrating, a verb. This is what happens in something. For instance, we can see in the picture in the book the characters interacting, telling a story. And illustrating is also in people's minds. The illustrating is completed once there has been a transmission of knowledge or understanding. When we consider not illustration as in an object, but illustrating as a function, then we start to see how many things can illustrate. Pictures in your head, for instance, is a form of illustration. Watching a performance that describes something is illustrating. Listening to music may illustrate. A descriptive text can be considered an illustration. And in fact, this was the original meaning of the word illustration up until the late 18th century. We can see that almost anything in the world could be said to illustrate something grammatically. For instance, mashed potatoes in the form of a cat may illustrate your boredom at a supper party. I would like to turn now to the etymology of the word illustration to unpack more of its hidden meanings and connotations for a European audience. The root word is look, meaning light or brightness. It is the root of the ancient Greek and Latin Hittite words such as lukos, illuminare, illustrare, lux, lumen. All these words together infer concepts of shining, of brightness, of light, of lamps, of glowing. It affects all these other languages, which also refer to light, seeing, looking, or brightness. Out of these words, we get illustrate, illuminate, and elucidate and enlighten. So notice the connection that's going on. A triad emerges in which light reveals depictions which we look at in order to gain understanding or enlightenment. To see the light in English means to see the truth, to have a revelation of what is happening. In the Abrahamic religions, we see holiness associated with brightness, light, and fire. Here, The burning bush appears before Moses. In the Buddhist tradition, the Buddha is depicted with a nimbus of flame and a halo around his head. In the Hindu tradition, Shiva dances in the celestial fire. And yet there is a contradiction in illustration. And for this, let us turn to what Plato had to say on the matter. Plato's allegory of the cave. If you remember this story, you'll see that there are prisoners and they are captured in a cave where they have been all their lives, and they watch shadows on the wall. However, those shadows are cast from sculptures or puppets behind them. These are controlled by some artists or puppeteers, and there is a fire that casts the shadow onto the wall. The prisoners mistake this for reality. One day a prisoner is taken from the cave. It takes his eyes a while to adjust, but then he has enlightenment. He sees the world for what it really is, and now he is wise. This picture does not show what happens next, which is that our hero returns to the cave because he wants to tell the other prisoners, hey, there's this place outside where it's real, where there's a brighter light. Come, be enlightened. This presents a bit of a problem. How do you explain something if you can't show the original? So what does he do? Well, you have to show a representation, of course. We are unhappily, perhaps, always reliant on illustration for enlightenment. This brings me to another sense of the word. This is the word gel. It means to shine, call, or beckon, and it is also the root of the word yellow. Now look at this constellation of words. It can mean joyousness. It also is the root for gold, singing, boasting, yelling, gleaming, things that glimmer and glisten in the darkness. Perhaps you have heard this saying, all that glitters is not gold. With gel there is a warning. Very much like look, it projects. There is light, but it might be something that brings you to falseness, not truth. And so we can contrast two senses of the word illustrating. One brings enlightenment, and the other risks falsehood. It's the concept of gel, which is so closely related to advertising, to bluster, to tempting you with gold, foolishness, and falsehood. These associations are why Mallarmé famously said, I am for no illustration. This brings me to something that happened in my history class when I was introducing a content warning because we would be looking at difficult images. The student said, I hope we won't be exposed to explicitly discomforting images for the sake of learning. Well, I was a little taken aback at first. Of course we're here to look at images in order to learn. What are we going to do if we don't look at images? In Europe, we still remember 500 years ago when people tore images out of churches and burned them. We remember Nazis burning books. There is a strong association with censorship being a shutting down of knowledge, the exact opposite of enlightenment. We also come from a very strong belief in the value of journalism. Witnessing has been extremely important in confronting war crimes. These images suggest that we have a duty to witness in order to confront, to fix. I chose to ask my Facebook circles about what they would do with a student who did not want to look at disturbing images in an art history class. My friends and colleagues were split. Some said the burden is on the student to suck it up or leave art school for something safer. On the other hand, I had some people note that my Syrian students didn't need or want to imagine the effects of conflict imagery. After reflecting on the feedback, I decided to exercise quite rigorous safe space policy for my class, where I put objectionable images into a folder that is optional to look at. In this, I am following a swing in pedagogy towards allowing students to self-direct how and when they learn. Minority and marginalized students may be more impacted by painful images. There is an article that recently came out in the Journal of Illustration by Amberly Green and Chinook Sarkar. in it, Amberly Green asks, does societal cultural preference still decide our visual narratives? And by our, she means marginalized people. She discusses vicarious trauma, where forcing students to look or watch things that they find traumatic actually piles more trauma onto people who are already struggling with it. Amberly also discusses how one particular student of color had a difficult time in her classes. Tutors were indifferent to her abstract illustration practices. Those tutors wanted her to go into her experiences to create something that they felt was more representative of her. It's important to note that this was the tutors projecting their idea of how a person of color should present themselves to the world, of what kind of work that person should do to understand their experience. And it hints at an expectation that people who have undergone oppression or trauma need to or have a duty to share that with the rest of us. Amberly Green asks, is there an addiction to portraying distress? There may be an addiction. There is definitely a market. And so we are back to that concept of gel, of the shiny, loud, boasting, yelling, selling feature of illustration. Who is that for? How can illustrating in the sense of Luke avoid illustrating in the sense of Gel? It seems to me that we need to separate out Luke from Gel in order to avoid re-traumatizing people who don't deserve it, and also to communicate difficult concepts such as trauma without reducing them to stereotypes or to falsehoods. And we need to re-examine this triad and break our dependency on looking to find our idea of enlightenment. This is not a universal value. This brings me back to the student's idea of abstract illustration. Perhaps abstract illustration is a way to escape Gel. This brings me to the concept of aniconism. This is the word that we give the declining of showing something rather than the displaying of it. For instance, in the depiction of Buddha on the left, we don't see Buddha, we see his absence. In the depiction on the right, we see the Prophet Muhammad, but we do not see his face. The image of Buddha is made as a funerary remembrance. He has departed this world and left us bereft. So we mourn, but it also represents transcendence. And the image of the Prophet leaves something to our imagination because we cannot capture the ineffable or an ideal in any one image. This is the enso. It is done in a state of meditation. It's a frame, and yet it frames a void. This space is a place for meaning to remain open. I would liken this to the concepts that we have in semiotic theory, where the act of semiosis is that meaning is never closed. I would like now to turn to the dalang or puppeteer of the wayang kulit tradition to speak about the significance of shadows.
Biasanya erat hubungannya dengan Tuhan, manusia, dan segala hidupnya, segala kehidupan di dunia. Itu memang selalu kalau wayang itu lebih komplit daripada tarian yang lain, karena wayang itu erat hubungannya dengan sebelumnya harus minta anugerah Tuhan. Karena deep filosofi, sebab di dalam hidup ini adalah illusion, bayangan. Saya harap orang di sini senang menonton. Ya, karena wayang itu adalah dunia yang kecil, sama dengan alam juga. Itu artinya wayang. Karena itu menonton wayang itu sama seperti melihat diri sendiri gitu.
We learn from the dalang that life has illusions, shadows, that if studied lead to self-understanding. This is diametrically opposite to Plato's teachings, and I think a very important corrective to Plato. When you watch, it's like you see your own shadow. I draw your attention to this sequence where the icon goes aniconic. This transposition allows the viewer to project their thoughts into a place that cannot be pictured. Shadows are also taken up by the curator Anita N. Bateman, who curated an exhibition called Defying the Shadow, on view at the Rhode Island School of Design this year. She writes, operating in the shadow comes with a legacy of resistance, both in spiritual and ideological forms. This anti-visibility is not the same as being invisible. Rather, it is the power to operate against systems of imperial domination, including the gaze. It also legitimizes and reclaims the shadow as a place of refuge, instead, contra Plato, of being a place from which to escape. Mallarmé said he was for no illustration. He said that everything a book evokes should happen in the reader's mind. He didn't really mean no illustration. He was quite open to illustration that evokes rather than preaches. In fact, when he made this famous statement, he was in the middle of collaborating with Odilon Redon, who was devising lithographic illustrations for an edition of Mallarmé's own works. Odilon Redon used ambiguous images, voids, and shadows to make a space where the reader completes the meaning of the poem. I return to the proposition that we're here today to make a laboratory for the testing of the definitions of illustration and illumination. Illustration, a creative production that intends to communicate data, sensations, concepts, and values through material or imagined manifestations for the purposes of deepening knowledge, awareness, and sensory experience. I invite you all to respond to this definition. It is provisional, meaning that we should perform experiments on it to see if it holds up to the current range of illustrating and illustration that happens in the world today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaylene Grove. I'd like to remind the audience that there will be an opportunity to join a Zoom discussion afterwards where we will discuss the topics that were brought up in the presentations. If you don't already have the link to the meeting, it will be provided on the illuminating.no and the kmd.uib.no websites, and also in the program under the stream. These three presentations will convey the three core artistic research projects that are embedded in the main project, Illuminating the Non-Representable. Our first speaker is Head of Education at the Falstad Center, Sebastian Klein. The Falstad Center is a Norwegian museum, memorial, and human rights center north of Trondheim. Sebastian Klein is also the Mid-Norway project leader of Dembra, a program for schools for the prevention of racism, group-based hostility, and anti-democratic attitudes. The Falstad Center has entered a cross-disciplinary research cooperation with Professor Hilde Kramer at the Faculty of Fine Art, Music, and Design here in Bergen. Their united research explores ethical and cultural semiotic consequences when site-specific narrative is transposed to another place. What these places share is being part of Holocaust history. The project he will present is called Er dette et menneske, which in English would be, Is this a human being?
Hello, my name is Sebastian Klein. I'm head of education here at the Falstad Center, and together with Hilde Kramer, I've been working on a research project of which I'm going to present to you some of our findings in this 15-minute presentation. Now, this is the title, as you might know, is Illuminating the Non-Representable, exploring artistic, ethical, and authorial challenges in research through illustration. What I'm going to do here in the next 13 minutes or so is I'd like to present to you our current explorations into the questions of what consequences the transposition of a site-specific learning method for young adults, high school and university students, concerning one aspect of the Shoah, or Holocaust, to a different geographical, cultural, and digital location in Europe might have for the participants involved. Now, this inquiry arises from a project that has already been developed and piloted by Hilde Kramer, which ran from 2016 to 2019 and is called This is a Human Being. Now, to begin with, I'd like to outline the history of the first project to give you a brief understanding of the methodology involved and some of the questions that have come up and been answered, before moving on to some of our recent findings and our further development of the previous project. Now, that project was completed in 2019, was finished piloted in 2019, and we took a lot of the methodology and sought to transpose those experiences that Hilde Kramer and I had from working with the project in Poland to a different European context, namely Norway's context. Touching briefly on methods that we used in this project, what you see here are portraits of Jewish individuals who were killed during the war from Trondheim. I've opened a box here where you can see a small paper wrapping. Each of these wrappings, they contain a stone such as this. And here is the paper wrapping. And on the paper, within the paper, there's written a birth date, which is machine written onto the paper beforehand, and then the stone is wrapped. And it's each student is given one of these paper wrappings, one of these parcels is handed out, and there's the first part of the project is to open the parcel, look at the stone, feel the stone, keep the stone in your hand, and the stone represents, as a metaphor, as a memory, a metaphor for the memory of that person. You might be familiar with the Jewish tradition of placing stones on graves of the deceased as a ritual. And this is, of course, part of the inspiration for this method of remembering. Now, after they're given each of these stones and they have the date, the students are given a map over the city. So here's the map. The map contains several legend numbers. These numbers refer to various birth dates that you can see on the right. And all of these numbers are then again placed around the city, referring to the places where the individual provided on the paper with the stone used to live. Now, one of the first tasks of the students is to draw the stone that they've been given and spend some time familiarizing themselves with the stone, with the paper. After that, they are to identify the area of where their individual stone resided, and from this map and from the dates and area, they are to use a digital archive to gather information on who their individual was and what happened to them during the war. So one of the differences that we have in working with a Norwegian, in a Norwegian context and in the context of the Jewish victims of Trondheim is a digital archive which was developed a few years ago by the Jewish Museum in Trondheim, which has sought to digitize all the archives of Norwegian Jews in Trondheim and the region north of Dovre here in Norway. And what I'm showing you right now is Trondheim and all the zooming in on the city itself, of which you recently just saw a map. And all of these nodes relate to different people, their businesses, and you can categorize things after color here. Now, one of the other aspects of this digital archive and this app is that you can follow individual families and individual people who lived in Trondheim before the war, and you can follow their stories as well. So part of what the students are to do when presented with the dates and the areas and the sites where people lived is to make a digital search, use this digital archive as well as others to find more information and to put together the story of their individual person. Now, this, of course, using digital tools such as this archive creates a whole different set of questions as well when relating to the digital and the virtual in relation to the Holocaust. So these are things that we're also interested in exploring further. Are a lot of our experiences, we've had approximately 2 workshops with students at the moment before the pandemic hit. And I'll talk briefly about some of these experiences before I end this presentation. As I mentioned, we've had 2 workshops working with different student groups up till now. We were planning on having a few more student groups to gather some more data and information on the methods and how they worked. But what we're seeing is that we've been unable to, due to the situation, we've been unable to organize anything. But the feedbacks we have had have been mostly positive. We've seen that a lot of the students have had a different entrance, a different sort of motivating force going into working with this form of history, working with the individual people, so especially working with a tactile piece of rock as a metaphor for a memory has been a lot easier to grasp than we perhaps thought to begin with. We have also found that a lot of the reflections revolving around the use of a digital archive, the fact that it's the digital archive is quite user-friendly, has a lot to say for the students that we've tested. They've easily come across the information, and allowing them to use the computers, the smartphones that they have in their pockets in interacting with this method has also been a positive motivator for a lot of the students from the feedbacks. I think some of the issues that we're seeing is that transposing the experience of the Holocaust in the Lichtenstein ghetto to a Norwegian context is very different, as the archival material is very different, and the situation that the people, the historical victims, found themselves in could also be defined as quite different. There is a slight concern of the sensitivity of the subject, that this is too much of a gamification. These are some of the questions that we're looking to further develop and look into as well. The fact that we're mixing an aspect of the sacral ritual of using the stone as a metaphor for memory, that is also a concern, that we're sacralizing and ritualizing this as a learning and teaching method. My fears is that there is too much emotion and too much, or there will be too much affect in the role of relating this history and experience, that it really needs to be contextualized and not just worked with in a one-off sort of workshop setting. Now, those are some of the key points that we've touched on, and we'd be both, me and Hilde Kramer would be both happy to take some more questions and try to give some answers for anything that you're further curious about. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian Klein from the Falstad Center. We now move on to present the second illumination, presented by independent artist Imi Mof, who lives here in Bergen. Her presentation is called Non-Book, Designing a Book that Conveys the Holocaust in Lichtenstein Ghetto, 1939 to 1945. The project investigates how special book design can act as part of the narrative of complex content.
Hi, my name is Imi Morf, and today I'm going to talk about books boxed for this presentation. Well, I've worked a lot with artist books, but also with the box format, and I've always been intrigued by the way that you can open up a box and reveal the book inside. And I think a lot of this has to do with the childhood fascination of cardboard boxes. I spent a lot of time sitting inside them, but also receiving a Christmas present every year from my mum, which was a miniature version of books in a box that came slipped out of a slipcase. So they were like picture books in a miniature version, and they could fit in the palm of my hand. And there was also the movement that you do when you take a book out of a box. I think that the interaction that the box creates when containing books is one of its special qualities. It adds extra dimension to handling a book. There is a performance and surprise involved when opening the box and finding the contents. A traditional way of bookbinding boxes to protect books is this slipcase, just like the one I've just showed with the children's books in it. Designed especially to protect a book, and it doesn't have any conceptual part of the actual book. So purely a functional way of containing a book. Next, I'm going to talk about box as collection. By expanding the slipcase, as in this project by Dieter Roth, his collection works, volumes 1 to 20, and from 1969 to 1979, in his catalogue Raisonné. It could be said that this is part of a bookshelf, but the box keeps the collection together. This one is called Bibliothèque Nordica. Opens like this. And it is a collection of 82 books by Nordic artists, and it was produced by Codex Polaris. Codex Polaris is an artist group based in Bergen that promotes artist books from Norwegian and Nordic countries. And it was a project that I worked on in collaboration with Megan Addy and Bent Quistgaard from Denmark. So each of the books are A6 in size, but they're very different in context and in methods of production. And this box has been produced in an edition of 10 and was first launched at the Codex Book Fair in California in 2019. Living North of the North Tyne is a collection of 8 editioned books, and it comes from an artist residency that I did in the north of England in 2008. And it opens like this. It's been designed especially to travel on a mobile library that used to run through the valley that I was living in, so that people could take it out on loan just as they would a novel, and to be able to interact with the contents in the comfort of their own living rooms. The Unfortunates by B.S. Johnson is an experimental novel in a box. It opens out in a clamshell binding, and you're instructed to read the first chapter and also the last chapter, but all the chapters in the middle are produced loose-leafed. So it's up to the reader to read them in the random order that they choose. The novel was first published in 1969, and this is a reproduction produced in 1999. Marcel Duchamp, The Bride Stripped Bare of Her Bachelor's Even, The Green Box, is a collection of 94 loose sheets of notes, reproduced exactly from their originals. It documents the making of his work, The Large Glass, and it is like an interactive instruction manual where the viewer can choose the order he reads it. The Book of Disquiet, in this case, has been produced by Tim Hopkins from the Half Pint Press in London, and it takes a collection of notes from Pessoa, who on his death left a whole trunk full of notes on single sheets of paper with no instructions of how they could or should be produced or published. And a lot of copies have been published where different selections of the notes have been placed in different orders, but in a bound book. So there's been a lot of discussion about how and why they should be placed in those orders. Whereas Tim, in this case, has used the box format, selected 60 of the notes, and has printed, using letterpress, the text onto different types of paper and objects. So in here you find like a series of negatives and an envelope and bus tickets and musical notes. And again, because of this loose leaf unbound section inside the box, the reader can read it in any order. So it represents very much more of the original contents of the book, or contents of Pessoa's notes that he made before he died. This work by Marcel Duchamp, The Box in a Suitcase, was produced from 1935 to 1966 in an edition of 300 and he produced them in 7 series, so they were slight difference in variation. In this portable museum or portfolio, Duchamp reproduced in miniature scale his previous works inspired by travelling salesman sample kits and influenced by his life in exile during the Second World War. This is a complex box format that opens up to various directions with sliding elements, single sheets, fold-out books, and replicas of sculpture work. This is a quote from Marcel Duchamp. LK243, this box here, is a project from an artist in residency that I did in 2011 when I was on board the Swan during the tall ships races, which sailed from Ireland to Sweden via Scotland. This box was originally made to fit at the end of my bunk, which was my only personal space during the voyage. It was tiny, and at the end of the residency, I collected all the experiences that I'd had and made books and prints and other artifacts that were then contained in the box. So the box opens out and has a selection of artist books in here, and it also has 500 drawings from the public. And I used this tray here to collect the drawings with the public, and then it also opens out here with the lid and has in this top bit a display of prints and curtains. And then I'll turn the box around because it has another side to it. And opens out again this side to display a selection of postcards, which I threw a postcard twice a day into the sea during the voyage, and then 8 of them were found and sent back to me. So an example of a box that can be handled, but it can also expand into an exhibition space with all the works inside being hung up on the walls. Sum of Parts by Megan Addy is a box that incorporates the book. The book is part of the box and cannot be removed from it, but you can read it. And it's about the foreclosures in the financial crisis in America in 2008, where people were being thrown out of their houses because they could no longer pay the mortgage. And Megan here has looked at the fact that they were actually taking away with them the pipes from the house and the flooring and even the walls in some cases, and looking at each individual element within the house. But the box here is very much a house as well as being the book itself. Tina Jonsbo's index cards uses a box found. So like all the other examples I've shown you, all the boxes have been made especially for the project. This found box is an index card box and contains index cards, which she has drawn on. Tabernacle, Whole, Horse and Hell box by Ron King of the Circle Press UK. It is a box that contains 7 drawers, each representing 7 generations of the printing tradition in the King family. Ron King was given a box that contained letterpress equipment, and which he coincidentally found out was part of the King printing business. This box is a replica of the original one and has been produced in an edition of 50. The drawers contain rubber stamps and metallic moving letters, bound books, fold-out posters and display boards. It has an element of performance where the Movable letters and rubber stamps have actually been used to create the book involved, and there's also poetry by Roy Fisher. I couldn't do a talk about boxed works without mentioning the Fluxus movement of the 1960s and 70s. Water Yam by George Brecht is another performance piece, a sliding box, much like an outsized matchbox, containing a large collection of cards with instructions known as event scores or flux scores. Whether carried out in public, private, or in the imagination, the random method that the cards could be read in leads to an almost infinite amount of chances and interpretations. Lyric Rain by Kurt Johannesson, an artist and performer based in Bergen, is a box that contains 234 pieces of paper, and each of the pieces of paper has a text on it. And these were originally used in a performance where he showered the audience of the opening ceremony for the Bergen International Festival in 2001 with 460,000 texts as a performance. And this box sort of is a presentation of that performance, but it also invites you to repeat it. Flux editions were designed by George Macinus, with contributions by fellow artists. In the edition Flux Yearbook in 1965, the partitioned wooden box with assembled works was the final result. In his request for ideas, Macinus indicated that the edition will be, quote, limited to book events only, i.e. events that are enacted by the reader automatically as he inspects the book or box. I like to think of this one as a performance piece. Mini Zines is a collaborative project initially started by Banana Fish in Shanghai in China, and this Norwegian version was produced by Northings, who are a collective in Bergen. And 100 Norwegian artists and designers were asked to contribute with a mini zine idea, which were reso printed, and then they've been produced in these boxes. So each box contains 12 random collections of books. And each of the artists that took part received a box back that had their own contribution to the project. In 2013, I curated an exhibition at the Kunstlerhaus Dortmund in Germany with Rona Rauch, and it was called Voyage, Sea Journeys, Island Hopping and Transoceanic Concepts. And it was a large exhibition that everybody wanted to travel afterwards, but we didn't have the funding or the time capacity to do that. So I decided that it would be a really good idea to make a miniature version of the exhibition. So I invited 18 of the artists that had taken part in the original one, and to produce a piece of work that was 15 by 15 centimeters relating to the work that they had in the original exhibition. So this is the result of that project. So again, a collaborative project containing, or a collaborative box containing a lot of works. And it's also been really interesting in the way that this box has then been the travelling part of the exhibition, and how it's been displayed in different settings. So in a museum setting, or in a tiny perspex box in a bigger exhibition, or displayed on the wall in a gallery space. Boxes are fantastic objects to contain collaborative work. And quite a lot of the work that I do is collaborative, like Bibliothek Nordica that I just showed earlier. And then I've got these two examples here that are posted, unposted projects. They're also Codex Polaris projects. This one I did in collaboration with Lena Nordenstrom, and it's the Nordic letterpress collaboration. and it contains inside a collection of works on envelopes with contents by artists from the Nordic region. So, up this. Each of the artists contributed with an addition of 40 envelopes. So we've made these boxes in an addition of 40. Very much looking at different ways of printing and working within the envelope format. And the box that houses it keeps it all together. And then this is an example from the next version of Posted Unposted, which I've produced with Angie Butler in the UK. And it's a collection of envelopes very much in the same format as the first Posted Unposted, but this time from artists in the British Isles. I'm just going to show you a sneak preview here because we haven't actually published it because it's got stuck in Corona lockdown problems, so it's still in the UK. But this should be coming out next year. I love the versatility of the box and how they can and how they have been used in relation to artists' books. This is a snapshot of my influences and past practice, and it is the starting point of my collaboration with Hilda Kramer and the Illuminating the Non-Representable research project.
Thank you, Imi Mof. The final project presented today is called Sonic Illustrations. This is a cross-disciplinary cooperation between researcher Anna Carrasco from the Meteorological Institute in Oslo and Fredrik Rysjedal, independent artist living here in Bergen. How can weather data, site-specific history from World War II, and sound come together to become illustration? These experimentations were made during autumn 2020 here at the Faculty of Fine Art, Music and Design, assisted by head engineer Arthur Uro.
My name is Anna Carrasco. I am an oceanographer and I work at the Norwegian Meteorological Institute. I do forecasting of waves. I study oceanography in the University of British Columbia in Canada, and I have been working at the Met for 15 years. And in the last 10 years, I have worked with waves. A wave is a propagating disturbance that travel through a medium. So seismic waves travel through the ground, sound waves travel through the air, and water waves travel through the water. The sound waves are spherical in the sense that when you have a source of noise, for example, the noise will propagate in all directions, more or less. And the waves are not like that. When the waves propagate in the surface of the ocean, they are between two fluids, the air that has and the water, and both have a very different density. So the waves are trapped in the surface of the ocean, and this is the only way they can propagate. We are very familiar with waves because we have seen them always. We know that the waves have period, a frequency. We know how often they come. We also know that they change direction. We also know that when the crests are very short, very close together, I mean the two high points, these other are short waves, and when the waves, the two crests are far, they are long waves. And we also know that they break. We know that when the wind blows for a long time in a big area in the ocean, the surface of the ocean, we get wind waves. But we don't know exactly the details of this transformation of energy from the wind to the waves. But what we know is that when the wind starts blowing, a little thin layer starts moving with some velocity, and some waves start generating, very small waves. And then after the generation of these waves, the energy transformation from the wind to the waves goes faster because the area has increased. From a flat bottom, now we have this stretchy surface that then, so it's more efficient, the transmission of energy from the wind to the waves. And then these new waves are like mountains, they have some different shapes, there is also a spray, and they kind of appear and disappear, and they kind of move in all directions, and some frequencies, but essentially in different directions. And then we call these ones windsea. And then the wind keeps blowing, and then new waves are generated, and these waves are faster than the winds, and they abandon the generation region, and they have a life by their own. These waves are called swell, and they can travel long distances. In the ocean, we can see them from satellite, and around Antarctica there is this corridor of storms that happens all year round. We have storms around Antarctica, and then we can see that some waves in the Pacific can travel from these storms in Antarctica up to California. It takes them around 12 or 15 days, depending on the velocity, but we can see them. So it's amazing that even if they lose energy, they can still get there. And then swell also can get into the sea ice, but of course at that time they have very small amplitude, like centimeters, but they survive. People have measured the frequency of these waves. So these waves are long waves. They practically travel in one direction in contrast to the other ones that are underneath the storm that are in all directions, and they are very fast. But when we study the surface of the ocean, there are this combination of two types of waves everywhere. So these waves are dispersive, and what this means is that waves at different frequency travel at different velocity. So the way to illustrate that is, imagine that you have swell, a train of waves. This is the way they usually travel. It's not only one wave, it's a train of them. And you have 10 waves in this train. So in a very calm weather. So these waves travel in an envelope. And then you can see then that all of them together travel at one velocity. But the waves inside this train travel in another velocity. They travel faster. And what happens is that the first one starts disappearing and another one is being born at the tail. And one explanation of this is that the wave in the front is grabbing energy from in the front and is leaving more energy behind. And so there is a deficit. And so this wave is going to disappear, but at the end there is another one being born. This is typical of dispersive waves. The surface waves, these wind waves, also when they travel, they generate a little current underneath that. The current is much slower than the phase velocity. The waves were very fast, and this velocity is very small. This velocity can influence the first 10 meters or 15 meters of the water column, and they interact with the already existing ocean currents. And also when these waves break, they grab air from the atmosphere, and then they make bubbles, and they transfer this turbulence to the already existing ocean currents. So the wind waves, they derive the energy from the wind, they transfer energy to the currents with bubbles, and they create this current that I told you in the surface in all the oceans. The way we study these wind waves in research is that we make numerical models. And it's difficult to describe how one wave behaves from this place to this place. So what we do is that we use something called a spectral analysis. In this, we assume that the surface of the ocean It's a sum of many waves of different frequencies and directions. And then in the model, we analyze how a quantity that has all the statistical properties of them, like how many waves are in this frequency, how many waves are in this direction. We see how this quantity changes in time, space, and in frequency and direction, because the frequency and direction changes lower than other variables. And then after that, we can also go back to this messy surface of the ocean.
Hello, I'm Hilde Kramer, Professor of Illustration here at the Faculty of Fine Art, Music and Design at the University of Bergen. I'm also the coordinator of the Artistic Research Network Illuminating the Non-Representable, exploring artistic, ethical and authorial challenges in research through illustration. This is the first symposium of 3, Transposition as Artistic Practice, and you've heard a lot of perspectives and seen artistic approaches to transposition. We will now have a short intermission, 20 minutes, and we will be back 17:15 Central European Time, when I will be joined by Imi Morf and Fredrik Ryschedal. We will meet the rest of the presenters on Zoom, and you can join by following the link you find either on the webpage of the project, illuminating.no, or on the KMD website. For those of you who do not have the opportunity to stay with us, I welcome you back tomorrow, the same time, 15:00 Central European Time. So, see you soon.